What I'm doing here is introducing myself or the instructional design team to instructors and educators. So what I want them to do after this is have a good idea of how we as a design team can help them. Also, what they need to look at in order to provide us with what we need to help them. I also want to emphasize that it isn't necessarily creating everything from scratch. Often people are using PowerPoints or there are other resources that they can use. So basically don't reinvent the wheel. And another issue that isn't as relevant with face-to-face is copyright issues. Once things go out onto the internet, it becomes more of an issue. So one of the first things I want them to look at in terms of what goes onto an online course is the idea of chunking. One major function of chunking is that it allows students to focus on areas that they're not understanding and spend less time on areas that they find easier. Of course, students might be wrong about that, so what I also encourage is to provide questions on each chunk. As the instructional design team, we can help them with the process of embedding questions and ensuring that the student didn't just have information go in one eye and out the other. Many people use videos in the classroom. We can help embed videos, and we can also help embed questions into videos or provide questions that come after them. Questions can be graded or simply required in order for the student to progress further. So not everything has to be graded, but I believe there should be a question or two about each chunk in order to make sure that the student was actually paying attention. And often additional content is required in an online course. So one of our jobs is to help instructors find new content, and then of course to ensure that there are no copyright issues. And I just put this in here because I think it's slightly amusing. This is an animation I made to help students understand the endocrine system. So what we're telling the student here is that an increase in oxytocin causes the uterus to contract, and that causes a positive feedback, which causes more production of oxytocin, which causes more contraction. I think the baby's a little cute touch, and it adds a little something that makes things slightly less mundane. Just as another demonstration of what can be done, the content can be put in with quizzing. This is just an example of what might be done. And here we have the quiz. And I'm going to guess wildly that C is the synovial membrane. And submit the question, and I get it correct. This could be posted and added to a student's score, or it could simply be something that had to be completed before they could progress. What I want to get across here is that there are threshold concepts that are difficult concepts for students to understand, and in a classroom, you can see a blank face of a student. You can see when they're not getting this. As you cannot do that online, we have to make a little extra effort to make sure that those things are communicated. Often these concepts have been dealt with by someone else, and often those resources are available freely online. But of course, that's something that the instructional designer would be involved in making sure that the copyright's not infringed. Outcomes, syllabus, and outlines. Again, because we are not face-to-face with our students, they become even more important. Though obviously the content of outcomes needs to be the same for the same course. Outlines benefit the educator because they provide a framework from which to build from. And they also give the students a very clear idea of what they need to understand in order to succeed. The syllabus is extremely important, again, for basically the same reasons. Things that have to be added are how and when you communicate with your students, and due dates need to be very clearly defined. As always, you're involving computers, so you're going to involve technical support as well. So another area that is probably more the instructor's purview than the instructional designer is to make sure that whatever you put in your syllabus in terms of time availability you can meet. Students become extremely frustrated if they don't know when they're going to get a reply to an email, or if they're going to get a reply. If they're given a deadline and it's always met, then they get confidence, and they have confidence in their instructor. And they're particularly fussy about that if they meet all their deadlines and the instructor doesn't. So discussions are another thing that we can help set up for educators. There are lots of benefits that I'd like the instructor to realize. One of the things that's a major benefit of e-learning that you don't have with face-to-face is the time to think. Someone can post something to a discussion and then receive a reply 2 hours later when the person's had an hour or so to think about the answer. So potentially that leads to much deeper discussions. Group discussions with students can help student 1 recognize a misconception with student 2. Another major advantage of this is students and teachers get to know each other. This is something they might do face-to-face, but often it doesn't happen with many of the students. Many of the students run out of a classroom and go to the next class. I always have a student that sits back in the corner and doesn't say anything to anybody. And that student is essentially going to be forcibly made to become involved in discussions, but it's not going to be in as threatening an environment as face-to-face. And so here's a little question to make sure that the educator was paying attention. And one of the benefits of online learning is that students have time to think about their reply to a discussion. I'm going to say that's true. Correct. And I scored 20 out of 20 for that really difficult question. So assessment online is done essentially in the same way, in many cases, as a face-to-face class. You can have multiple choice, you can have long answers and matching. But in addition to that, it's much easier to add self-assessment quizzes that have instant feedback. So instantly the student knows they don't have to be graded on paper. They can be dotted around throughout the course at appropriate points. Discussions are easy to add. Small group projects are much easier in many ways online. It's very much easier to have a peer review where one student can review another student's comment. Another thing, you can have an expert reviewing answers in discussions given by students. That adds a lot of variety to the means of testing. So this means that the work is not only read by the teacher as it is in a normal face-to-face class. There's a much wider audience which tends to validate what the student wrote from the student's point of view. And those add up to create a feeling of more meaning for the student in terms of their work. So students now can learn anywhere, on any device, at pretty much any time. This of course creates problems because we can fairly easily produce things in a format that suits a regular desktop. But now we have students looking at iPads and iPhones and PCs, and sometimes they're in landscape format and sometimes they're in portrait format. And what we can do as instructional designers is we can help the educator set up in a way that the students can use almost any device and different devices throughout their course as well. And that is transparent to the user. So the user doesn't really know anything about changing from device to device. As far as they can see, they're looking at the same course on an iPad as versus an iPhone. Another thing that can be useful is location awareness. Another thing we can do with learning devices is, as well as know what device the student is using and providing the correct format, we can also be aware of the location of the student. And in that sense, we could have a student in Western Australia that has to complete a task by 9 p.m. and we can have a student in Auckland that has to complete the same task by the same time of day, and the system will take care of the fact that they're in different time zones. And thank you for your time. I hope you have learned something, because now you have to do the quiz for Module 1. At least you would if you were genuinely taking this course.